So now we're going to talk about the actual wage and occupation discrimination. Now the first thing is to really just define what discrimination is. And labor market discrimination is said to exist if workers that have identical productive characteristics, i.e. education, experience, so forth, if they are treated differently because of the demographic group to which they belong. There are two basic types of discrimination: wage discrimination and occupational discrimination. Wage discrimination is said to be present when there's prices that are paid by employers for a given productive characteristic that are systematically different for different demographic groups, men and women, or minorities versus non-minorities, so forth. And when there's equal productive characteristics that are paid unequally, even in the same occupation. And so, for example, let's just say that there's an accounting firm, and that accounting firm hires two people who went to the exact same school, they got the exact same scores, they pay one person $60,000 a year, they pay the other $50,000 a year. And if the only difference between the two of them is that one was male and one was female, well, that is wage discrimination. The second type of discrimination, and the one that's not talked about as much, is the occupational discrimination. And when you talk about with gender, occupational segregation is shown when there are female-dominated occupations and male-dominated occupations. And these occupational choices or decisions are directly limited to the differences by that group. And so, for example, construction. Construction jobs are typically do not hire women applicants. Certain serving jobs in restaurants, they typically will hire more females. So these are examples of occupational discrimination. So now let's turn to some of the theories behind market discrimination. Now, one of the things that we tend to assume in economics is that firms are out to maximize their profits. However, when it comes to something like discrimination, it may be about maximizing utility, or in other cases, it could be to where discrimination is necessary in order to maximize their profits. And we'll talk about them in a second. So there's three types of personal preference models that look at, personal prejudice models that talk about discrimination. The first is the employer discrimination. And so this is when an employer prefers just not to associate with a specific demographic group. And here's an example of two wages. So you have WF, which is wages for females, WM, which is wages for males, and then D. Now that D is a discrimination coefficient. And with these types of employers, profit maximization is not the same as utility maximization. These employers are willing to forego some profits in order to not work with a specific group. And so in this model, the difference between what males earn and females earn is going to be that D coefficient there. The second type of personal prejudice model is the consumer or customer discrimination one. Now, this is where discrimination becomes necessary if the employer wants to maximize profits. And the reason why is because there are some times when customers prefer to avoid being served by certain demographic groups. Now, like I mentioned, the main problem here is that profit maximization could dictate paying a lower wage to employees since they would not bring as much revenue. And so if you work in a area that has a prejudice against a certain ethnic group, okay, it would be, if the firm wanted to maximize profits, they would not hire that group because they would not make as much because of the prejudice against them. The third type is the employee discrimination. And this is when there's just some employees who prefer not to work with certain demographic groups. The problem is that this is also about profit maximization, because if there's a group that prefers not to work with another group, then there'll be higher quit rates for that group, and that means that the firm has to hire more, train more, and so forth, all of which is going to be more expense to the firm. So those are the three types of personal prejudice models. Another type of market discrimination is statistical discrimination. Now, this type of discrimination is not based on the characteristics of an individual, but on the characteristics of the group as a whole. And so, for example, younger drivers, on average, are charged higher car insurance rates than older drivers. And the reason why is that, on average, younger drivers are going to be more reckless when driving and get in more accidents. And so, if you're 20 years old and the safest driver in the history of all 20-year-olds, you're still going to be charged like you are any 20-year-old. And so, the statistical discrimination is about what the group does as opposed to what the individual does.